What if justice came down to who you know? What if one wrong glance, one broken system, and one silent store was all it took to erase 70 years of dignity? They didn't check the cameras. They didn't ask a single question. They didn't care until they found out who her son was. But by then, the story had already gone viral. By then, millions were watching. By then, the question wasn't just what happened to Margaret Wilson. It became, what if it had been your mother? Because this wasn't just about a false arrest. It was about a truth no one wanted to hear. Until power walked through the courtroom doors. This is the true story of a woman they tried to silence, and a justice system that only listened when the nation was watching. If you're ready to see what they tried to bury, if you're not afraid of uncomfortable truths, then hit that subscribe button and join us at Black Footprints, where we follow the stories others leave in the dark and bring them into the light. Because this time, we're not looking away. The morning sun spilled lazily across the cracked sidewalks of Easton Street, gilding everything in a faded glow, nostalgic, like an old photograph curling at the edges. Margaret Wilson stood at her front gate, fingers wrapped around the cool metal, waiting for her knees to finish arguing with gravity. The city had changed, that much was certain. Where once stood corner stores and barber shops, now gleamed glass cafes with names that sounded like luxury soaps. Even the old laundromat was gone, replaced by a juice bar where no one seemed old enough to know what a clothesline was. Margaret wasn't bitter. Not exactly. She had learned to carry time the way some women carried grief, with quiet strength and the dignity of not explaining it to anyone. She tugged her sweater tighter around her shoulders and began her slow walk to Tony's Market, the last relic of her old life still standing. It was just a few blocks away, tucked beneath the shadow of a high-rise that hadn't existed 5 years ago. She only needed 2 things, bread and milk, but the ritual mattered. She had walked this same path for over 40 years. First with her husband, then pushing a stroller, later walking her son Elijah to school, while he clutched her hand and rattled off trivia about dinosaurs and the solar system. Elijah, just thinking his name brought warmth to her chest, and a small ache too. Her son had grown up to become the U.S. Attorney General. Not a lawyer, not a judge, the Attorney General of the United States. A black boy raised by a single mother in a neighborhood the city had long forgotten, and he had climbed higher than either of them dared to dream. But success, she had learned, builds walls as fast as it breaks ceilings. Elijah called when he could, sent flowers on her birthday, arranged chauffeurs for her doctor's appointments. But visits had grown rare, conversations shorter, and though he never said it, she knew. He was trying to outrun where he came from. Margaret never held it against him. She had raised him to run. Just before turning the corner, she noticed a young woman crouched near the mural on Easton and 3rd, adjusting the tripod of a small camera. Mia Rodriguez. Margaret had seen her once or twice on the local news, covering housing issues, tenant evictions, always asking the questions no one else wanted answered. Today, she was filming a segment on how gentrification had reshaped the neighborhood. Their eyes met for a moment. Mia offered a polite nod. Fingers still fiddling with her mic, Margaret returned it with a small smile, then kept walking. The truth was, Margaret didn't hate the new residents. They brought dog parks and bike lanes, sure, but they also brought stairs. The kind of looks that passed through her as if she were an old statue someone had forgotten to take down. She had become part of the scenery. The price of permanence was invisibility. Tony's Market came into view, its peeling red awning flapping against the breeze like an old song refusing to be silenced. She stepped inside, grateful for the familiar ding of the bell above the door. Just bread, just milk, in and out. But fate had other plans. Outside, Mia adjusted her lens, not knowing that what she was about to capture wouldn't be another quiet clip about changing demographics. It would be the start of a storm, one that would rip through the courtroom, the media, and the soul of the very system Elijah had sworn to protect. And Margaret, the retired teacher who only won a loaf of bread, was about to remind the nation what happens when the invisible decides to be seen. The refrigerator door let out a soft creak as Margaret Wilson reached for the milk. The cold air spilled out and kissed her skin, a small relief in the weight of the morning heat still clinging to her cardigan. She took a moment, steadied her breath, adjusted her glasses, and double-checked the expiration date. An old habit, one of those small acts of control that made her feel grounded. She didn't notice the boy at first. Just a flicker of motion in the corner of her eye. Someone younger, quicker, less careful. A hoodie pulled low over his forehead, sneakers barely touching the floor as he moved in a practiced rhythm. Grab. Stuff. Turn. Go. In the span of 10 seconds, his hands swept across the shelves like a wave. Protein bars, chips, 2 cans of soda, shoved into the deep pockets of his jacket. Margaret froze. Not out of fear, not exactly, but something older. Worn. The kind of tension you don't speak of, but carry in your shoulders. She stepped back instinctively, clutching the handle of her small plastic basket. She had seen boys like him before, bright-eyed, hungry, both literally and otherwise. But this one didn't look back, didn't pause. The bell over the front door gave a frantic jingle as he shoved it open and vanished into the street. Then came the beeping. High-pitched, piercing, the store's alarm screamed into the quiet morning, startling shoppers into stillness. A bag of oranges dropped. A child gasped. And from the back of the store, a man's voice sliced through the confusion like a razor. "Mom, stop right there." Margaret turned slowly, confused. "Excuse me," she said, blinking. But Officer Blake Turner was already moving, tall, built like a linebacker, badge clipped to his belt under a Navy windbreaker. His eyes locked on her like she was prey, caught mid-act. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. She blinked again. "Sir, I just got here. I haven't even paid yet. You were right by the shelf when it happened." "Don't play smart," he snapped. With no hesitation, he stepped forward and grabbed her arm. Not roughly, but not gently either. It was the kind of grip that said he'd already made up his mind. Margaret flinched, pulling back instinctively. "Let go of me," she said, voice trembling, more in disbelief than fear. "I said hands up. Empty your pockets." "I don't have pockets," she whispered, holding up her basket. "I was shopping. For milk." It didn't matter. The badge had spoken. Across the street, Mia Rodriguez was still setting up her tripod when the commotion caught her ear. She turned, camera in hand, and instinct took over. She hit record, zooming in through the display screen. She couldn't hear much, couldn't get a clear shot of the older woman's face, but she saw enough. A woman in a cardigan, gray hair, being turned around, handcuffed. The moment blurred, sirens growing louder, doors swinging, people watching and doing nothing. Not a single person in the store spoke up. Not the cashier. Not the man who had been in line behind Margaret. Not even Tony, the store owner she'd known for 30 years. They just looked away. And in the eye of it all, Margaret Wilson, retired schoolteacher, widow, mother of the U.S. Attorney General, was led away like a criminal. Without proof, without questions, without dignity. As the cruiser pulled off, Mia lowered her camera slowly. She didn't know the woman's name. Didn't know her story. Not yet. But something in her gut whispered, "This isn't over." Not by a long shot. The precinct smelled like old paper, burnt coffee, and a kind of tired resentment that seemed baked into the walls. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow sheen across the scratched linoleum floor. Margaret Wilson sat stiffly in the intake chair, wrists still aching from the handcuffs, dignity unraveling thread by thread. She had never been in a police station before. Not like this. Not as the suspect. Her entire life had been about respect, education, community. Now, she was a case number, a fingerprint, a mugshot on a screen. The booking officer didn't look at her when he said, full name? Margaret Louise Wilson. Age? 70. He grunted, scribbled something on a clipboard, and without a word, rolled the ink across her fingertips. The machine hummed and clicked. The camera flashed, catching her mid-blink, mid-shame. She blinked away the sting in her eyes. There would be no explanations here. No questions. Just procedure. "Take her to holding," the officer muttered. They led her down a hallway lined with narrow cells, each one humming with despair. Metal bars, concrete benches, and silence too loud to ignore. She was placed in a cell at the end of the corridor, zip ties biting into her thin wrists. The door slammed shut behind her. Across the room sat a young woman, no older than 30. Dark-skinned, tired eyes, sweatshirt sleeves pulled over trembling hands. She looked up, suspicious at first, then softened when she saw Margaret. "They get you too?" she asked. Margaret offered a slow nod. "For what?" Margaret exhaled, voice barely audible. "I was buying milk." The woman let out a short, bitter laugh. "I took a granola bar," she said. "My daughter was hungry. I didn't have enough cash. Didn't think anyone would notice." Margaret stared at her, heart cracking a little wider. "What's your name?" "Keisha Green." They sat in silence for a moment, two women, generations apart, but bound by the same injustice. Not because of what they had done, but because of what they looked like. Because they were easy to blame. Moments later, the cell door opened again. A young officer stepped in. Uniform neat, eyes clear, but anxious. His badge read Brooks. Officer Devin Brooks. He glanced at the file in his hand, then looked up at Margaret. Something shifted in his face. Confusion. Maybe doubt. He cleared his throat. "You're 70?" he asked, like he didn't believe what he was reading. Margaret nodded. "I taught third grade for 35 years, she said quietly. "Raised a son. He's a good man." Devin hesitated. "What's his name?" "Elijah Wilson." That got his attention. He blinked. "As in, Attorney General Elijah Wilson?" She nodded again, slower this time. "He's my son." Devin opened his mouth, then closed it. He stepped back from the bars like the words had weight. "Wait here," he muttered. He turned toward the bullpen, where Sergeant Hawkins was barking orders from behind a desk stacked with half-empty coffee cups. Devin approached, speaking low. "I think we need to look into this one." Hawkins didn't look up. "She fits the description." "Yeah, but," Devin started. "No buts. You want to keep that badge, Brooks?" "Then follow protocol." Devin stiffened. "Yes, sir." Back in the holding cell, Margaret closed her eyes. She had seen it in Devin's face. The flicker of conscience, the tiny rebellion. And she'd seen it crushed just as quickly. The system didn't need truth. It needed silence. Compliance. Labels. And in that moment, Margaret Wilson wasn't a teacher, or a mother, or a woman who had done nothing wrong. She was a number, and numbers don't speak. The phone sat on a cold metal shelf in the hallway, its cord frayed, receiver slick with years of nervous hands. Margaret Wilson stood before it, arms wrapped around herself like armor, heart pounding against the hollow of her ribs. The young officer who'd brought her here didn't say much, just pointed at the phone and muttered, "You get one call. 5 minutes. 5 minutes." She could call Elijah. The thought came like an ember, small but burning. Her boy. Her miracle. Her pride. Her shame. She stared at the phone. The dial tone waited. Somewhere across the city, he was probably in a polished office, surrounded by staff and silence. He was likely reading a case file that could change lives, or signing off on a national policy. He wasn't expecting a call from a jailhouse. He definitely wasn't expecting a call from his mother. Her fingers hovered above the keypad. She couldn't breathe. Margaret had spent her whole life shielding Elijah from the world that had tried to break her. She'd worked double shifts, packed his lunches, held his hand through every heartbreak and every injustice. And when he got that scholarship to Yale, she hadn't cried in front of him, but she'd wept into her pillow that night, grateful the cycle might end with her. But this would drag him back into it. The narrative would write itself. Attorney General's mother arrested for shoplifting. They wouldn't see the misunderstanding. They wouldn't care about the footage. They'd see a headline. And Elijah, who had worked so hard to be unimpeachable, would be pulled into the mud she had spent decades trying to clean off their name. Still, $10,000. That was the bail amount the prosecutor had casually thrown out like spare change. It felt obscene. She was 70 years old. She hadn't stolen anything, and yet she was being priced like a flight risk. A wave of nausea rose. She leaned against the wall, steadying herself. Pride was one thing, but prison was another. Meanwhile, across town, in a cramped editing booth at Channel 6, Mia Rodriguez stared at her laptop screen. The footage was shaky, blurry, recorded through the haze of city heat and window glare. But it was there, a cop, a woman, handcuffs. Something about it itched at her, like a puzzle piece jammed into the wrong corner. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a story. She slowed the video frame by frame. Gray sweater, white hair, gentle confusion in the posture, not guilt. She knew she had seen that face before. Mia opened another tab, searching for a name she had only heard once in a community roundtable. Margaret Wilson. She cross-referenced, and her breath caught in her throat. There she was, standing beside her son, Elijah Wilson, at a Justice Department ceremony 2 years prior. Mia blinked. No, that couldn't be right. But it was. She grabbed her phone and scrolled to her contacts. She didn't have Elijah's number, but she had something better. Darius Cole, a senior advisor on the DOJ's Community Relations Task Force. She had interviewed him twice. He owed her a call. She hit dial. Back at the precinct, Margaret still hadn't made the call. Her hand trembled. She reached the phone once more, then pulled away. Was it dignity or fear? Was it protection or pride? In that moment, she didn't know anymore. All she knew was that the line between survival and shame had never felt thinner. The phone sat there, humming with possibility. And somewhere, unknown to her, help was already on its way. The courtroom had never been this quiet. Not when the gavel slammed, not when the bailiff called for order. It was a silence far deeper, dense, breathless, the kind that comes before lightning hits the ground. Every eye turned toward the double doors just as they creaked open. Elijah Wilson stepped inside. His navy suit was sharp, almost severe against the sterile beige of the courtroom walls. He didn't pause. He didn't smile. His jaw was locked, expression unreadable, but his eyes were storm clouds. The Attorney General of the United States wasn't here on business. He was here as a son. At the defendant's table, Margaret sat stunned. She had not made the call. She hadn't had to. Somehow he knew. Judge Donald Mercer stiffened on the bench. His fingers, so steady moments before, now twitched over his gavel. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Craig Milton cleared his throat with a sudden cough, his earlier confidence folding under pressure. Elijah walked to the defense table and placed one hand gently on the back of his mother's chair. Margaret didn't look at him. She didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to pull the air back into her lungs. Your Honor, Elijah began, his voice calm but with a quiet edge that hummed with authority. I want the security footage. The original. Not a report. Not a summary. The footage. Judge Mercer blinked. Mr. Attorney General, I'm not sure. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I'm not here to debate. I'm here for the truth. Behind them, a young officer entered the back of the room, head ducked low. Officer Devin Brooks. Sweat lined his collar, but his eyes held a different kind of resolve. In his hand was a small, worn USB drive. Last night, after his conscience kept him awake long enough, Devin had gone back into the system, pulled the untouched camera footage, copied it, and slipped it to someone he believed might actually do something with it. Mia Rodriguez. 2 hours earlier, Mia had posted the footage with a single caption. #Justice for Margaret. She didn't expect it to explode. But it did. In less than 90 minutes, the video hit 1.2 million views. Twitter, TikTok, Hajichi, Instagram, cable news picked it up within the hour. People weren't just outraged, they were furious. A 70-year-old woman, confused and calm, wrongly cuffed while the real thief ran free. And not just any woman, the mother of the Attorney General. The system had picked the wrong person to make invisible. Now, the courtroom sat inside that storm. Elijah turned to the prosecutor. Is the footage available or not? Craig Milton stammered. There were reports of technical failure. The footage exists. Elijah cut in, holding up his phone. The public has already seen it. Now this court will too. Judge Mercer's face tightened. He tapped the bench twice, tried to retain some shred of control. Bailiff, bring in a projector. Moments later, the footage played. Grainy but clear. Margaret, slow and careful, lifting milk from the fridge. In the corner of the frame, a young man in a hoodie moving like smoke through the aisles, grabbing, stuffing, sprinting. Then beep, the alarm. And the officer grabbing Margaret with zero hesitation. When the footage ended, no one moved. No one breathed. Elijah looked up at the judge, voice low and deliberate. Dismiss the charges. Judge Mercer hesitated. Just for a moment. Then he nodded, barely audible. Case dismissed. The gavel hit wood. And just like that, Margaret Wilson was free. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The footage spoke louder than anyone in the room dared to. Grainy and raw. It played again on the courtroom monitor, this time in silence. Margaret Wilson, standing calmly in the dairy aisle, basket resting in the crook of her arm. Her posture steady, her pace unhurried. Then the thief, a blur in gray, sweeping through the shells like a wind that never touches the ground. He was in and out in seconds, long gone before Officer Blake Turner even stepped into frame. And yet, somehow, Margaret was the one in handcuffs. The courtroom remained still, frozen in the fallout of its own assumptions. The prosecutor stared blankly. Judge Mercer tapped his pen against the bench, his jaw clenched in something between embarrassment and defiance. No one said sorry. No one admitted the lie. The lie that the cameras weren't working. The lie that she fit the description. The lie that her voice, her truth, her age, her history meant nothing. Case dismissed, Mercer had said. But it wasn't justice. It was damage control. As Elijah helped his mother rise from the defense table, reporters already buzzed outside, waiting to descend. His arm around her shoulder was firm, protective, but his mind was elsewhere. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Again, a message flashed across the screen. Unknown number. No caller ID. He stepped into the hallway to answer. A voice, male, flat, practiced, came through the speaker. You made your point, Mr. Wilson. Elijah didn't speak. But if you keep pressing this, if you keep waving the footage around, poking holes where we've spent years sealing cracks. A pause. We'll start looking into your mother's past. You sure she's never made a mistake? Never raised her voice at a student? Never paid a bill late? Because if there's anything, we'll find it. Click. No name. No number. Just a threat. It wasn't the first time Elijah had felt the cold breath of power flexing its muscle. But this time, it wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at her. He looked back toward the courtroom door. Through the frosted glass, he could see the faint silhouette of his mother, stoic, small, but standing. Elsewhere, Mia Rodriguez sat in the quiet glow of her laptop screen. Her viral post had reached 3.7 million views in under 12 hours. She had become the unexpected face of a storm she wasn't sure she was ready for. The footage had been enough to clear Margaret's name. But now it was bigger than that. Her email pinged. No subject line. No sender. You don't know who you're messing with. Stop now or lose more than your job. She read it twice. Her hand hovered over the trackpad, uncertain whether to delete it or forward it to legal. Her heart raced. She wasn't afraid for herself. Not exactly. But she'd been in this game long enough to know when a shadow got too close. And this one wasn't bluffing. Still, she minimized the window, opened her notes app, and began drafting her next segment. When justice comes too late, the case of Margaret Wilson. Because she wasn't done. And neither, it seemed, were they. Back in the precinct hallway, Margaret stood by the window. The city buzzed beyond the glass. Cars honking, cameras flashing, people moving on. The court had set her free, but it hadn't said she mattered. And as Elijah stepped beside her, she turned to him, voice soft but sure. They're afraid of the truth. He nodded, because it never needed them to exist. They walked side by side toward the exit, not as a defendant and her defender, but as two witnesses to a system that cracked only when it was forced to. Justice had arrived, but its silence had already done the damage. The courtroom was nearly empty, but Margaret Wilson remained seated. Her hands, though now free of cuffs and zip ties, rested motionless in her lap. Not because she was tired, though God knew she was, but because she was thinking, processing, measuring the weight of everything that had just transpired, not just on her body, but on her spirit. The judge had dismissed the case. The charges were gone, but no one had said the words she longed to hear. I'm sorry. No apology. No reckoning. Just silence. She rose, slowly. Her knees cracked. The bench groaned beneath her as if protesting the act. But her voice didn't waver. Your Honor, she said, turning to face the bench. Judge Mercer looked up, surprised. He hadn't asked her to speak. She no longer had any procedural right to. But something in her presence, calm, unblinking, made even him listen. Margaret looked across the room, eyes sweeping over the jury box, the prosecutor's table, the officers by the wall. Her gaze stopped on Elijah, who gave a subtle nod. Then she asked the question that no one wanted to answer. "If my son wasn't the Attorney General of the United States," she said, voice clear and steady, "would I still be sitting here today? Free? Would any of you have checked the footage? Would any of you have listened to me, or believed me, or even looked me in the eye?" The silence that followed was suffocating. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just stood there, graceful, wounded, unflinching. Judge Mercer looked down at his papers. The prosecutor cleared his throat, but said nothing. The bailiff avoided her gaze. No one answered. And that, she knew, was her answer. She turned to leave, her cane tapping softly on the tile as she moved toward the courtroom doors. Then, suddenly, from the gallery, a small voice broke through the tension. "Mrs. Wilson?" Margaret turned. A boy, maybe 10, 11, had stood up in the back row. He was wearing a too-big blazer, sleeves bunched at his wrists. His voice shook, but his eyes burned with something honest. "You were my teacher. 2nd grade. You taught me how to read." A pause. "You told me stories about heroes. You said even ordinary people could change the world." The courtroom stilled again, but this time not out of fear. The boy swallowed, then added softly, "I know you didn't steal anything. You don't steal. You teach people. You helped me believe I was smart." Margaret's throat tightened. She hadn't recognized him at first. His face older now, stretched by time, but the voice, the way he said smart with such care. Yes. She remembered. He was one of the ones who had come to school hungry, but left full of stories. The kind of kid you prayed would make it out of the neighborhood without getting swallowed by it. Now he stood for her, not because she was someone's mother, but because she had been his teacher. A murmur swept through the room. Not scandal, but something deeper. Respect. Margaret walked toward the boy, her steps slow, measured, as if absorbing every inch of the moment. When she reached him, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes damp but steady. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she turned back to the courtroom one last time. "I was invisible to you," she said, "until power made me visible. But to him," she gestured to the boy, "I mattered long before today. Maybe that's the justice we should all be fighting for." No one moved. No one objected. And for the first time since this began, it felt like the truth had actually landed. It had only been 72 hours since Margaret Wilson walked into Tony's Market for milk and bread. Now her name was on every screen in the country. Morning news anchors debated the case. Cable networks replayed the footage on loop. The hashtag Justice for Margaret topped Twitter trends for 2 full days. Civil rights leaders weighed in. Editorials flooded the headlines. How many Margarets have been forgotten? When justice depends on bloodlines, not truth. A system that listens only when power speaks. The pressure mounted fast. By the end of the week, Judge Donald Mercer was placed on temporary administrative leave. An internal affairs unit opened a full investigation into Prosecutor Craig Milton and Officer Blake Turner. Public defenders across the city began combing through other petty theft cases, looking for echoes of injustice swept under the rug. But no victory felt clean. Not to Margaret. She sat by her window that night, watching the city flicker below. Apartment lights blinking like Morse code against the darkness, streets still buzzing with sirens and soft horns. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The phone rang. She didn't rush to answer it. Just let it ring twice, 3 times, before finally lifting the receiver. "Hi, Mama." Elijah's voice was low, tired. Worn not by defeat, but by realization. "You should be asleep," she said softly. "I couldn't," he replied. "I keep thinking about everything I missed. Everything I didn't want to see." There was a pause. On the other end, Margaret could hear him inhale, slow, deliberate. "I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner." "You came," she said. "That's what mattered." Elijah exhaled. Then, with quiet fire, he said the words she hadn't expected, but needed more than he knew. "I won't let this happen again. Not to anyone." He meant it. She could hear it in the way his voice didn't shake. This wasn't the promise of a son to his mother. It was the vow of a man who finally understood what it meant to carry his power with purpose. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she brushed her fingers over the windowsill. She was still tired, still sore. Her wrists still bore the phantom ache of cold metal. But in that moment, something shifted inside her like a door, long stuck, creaked open. Hope. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that shouts and marches and demands headlines. The quiet kind. The kind that sits at a windowsill at 2 a.m., listening to her son's voice and knows, maybe for the first time in a long time, that something good might grow from this scar. "Thank you, Elijah," she whispered. They stayed on the line a little longer. Neither speaking, just breathing. Together. Across the city, reporters still wrote. Protesters still gathered. And somewhere in the inbox of a young journalist named Mia Rodriguez, 1,000 messages poured in. Stories from people who had been Margaret, or knew a Margaret, or feared becoming one. Change had not arrived, but had been stirred. And from her window, Margaret Wilson looked out at the world, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a seed planter. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to break the system. It's to outlive it and make sure the next voice, no matter how small, is finally heard.